special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, it is once again an honor and a privilege to stand on the floor of the House of Representatives to help anchor the Congressional Black Caucus's Special Order Hour, this hour of power where for the next 60 minutes, members of the Congressional Black Caucus have the opportunity to speak directly to the American people on an issue of great significance. Today's Special Order Hour topic is democracy in crisis, the reckless Republican assault on the right to vote in America. It is with great dismay that many of us come to the House floor today to speak to an issue of significance to the American people and our democracy. There is nothing more sacred to the integrity of the democratic process than the right to vote. And there are people throughout the years who died trying to secure the ability to participate in the franchise to help execute upon that great American promise of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to vote for those individuals who would represent them at the city, state, or federal level, regardless of race or religion, ethnicity, immigration status. And while we undeniably have made tremendous progress in America, clearly there's been an effort by some, unfortunately, led in part by people on the other side of the aisle, to stop something so fundamentally American as the unfettered right to participate in our democracy by voting. Today we're going to explore some of the history connected to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, widely regarded as one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever enacted by this august body. Of course, we know that in 2013, in the Shelby County versus Holder decision, the Supreme Court effectively gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, widely known as the pre-clearance provision, in a manner that has adversely impacted the ability of voting rights advocates and others to protect the ability of people to participate without obstacle or obstruction. It's my honor as one of the anchors of the Congressional Black Caucus Special Order to join in that responsibility with my co-anchor, who from the moment in which she arrived in the Congress has been a tremendous force for the district that she represents, a voice for the voiceless, someone who is both fierce in her beliefs but willing to reach out to others across the aisle in order to get things done on behalf of the American people. And it's now my honor and my privilege to yield to my distinguished colleague from Ohio, Representative Joyce Beatty.
Thank you so much, Congressman Jeffries. Mr. Speaker, tonight I rise this evening proud to stand with my co-anchor, my classmate, the gentleman from the 8th Congressional District of New York. Mr. Jeffries, I look forward tonight to tonight's Special Order Hour. Mr. Speaker, Congressman Jeffries and I, along with our colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus, will have scholarly debate on how our democracy is in crises because of the assault on the right to vote in America. As we just heard from Mr. Jeffries, and we will hear from others, voting is the voice of the people. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed with bipartisan support, established strong federal protections for the freedom to vote, banning or limiting many of the discriminatory election policies and practices of the Jim Crow South. Combined with subsequent legislation such as the National Voters Registration Act, which requires state agencies to provide opportunities for voter registration. The Voting Rights Act has helped our nation make significant progress in boosting voting for African Americans and other historically marginalized groups. But we find ourselves, Mr. Speaker, today facing our first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. As Mr. Jeffries referenced in Shelby, the Supreme Court decision reversed over 50 years of progress made to expand access to the voting booth and opened a pathway to new voting laws that discriminate against African American voters. As a result of Shelby, new voting restrictions have been put in place in 22 states, 18 of them, Mr. Speaker, Republican-led, since 2010, making it harder for millions of Americans to exercise their right to vote. The way states have been able to reduce the voting power of minority communities and put in place new voting restrictions in an effort to make it harder for millions of Americans to vote is appalling. Mr. Speaker, our democracy is in crisis. Our right to vote is under assault. Mr. Speaker, why would we want to make it harder for Americans to vote? I believe we should be making it easier for Americans to have access to the ballot box. But apparently some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle do not agree. We need to put forth a vote on the Voting Rights Act now. New laws range from strict photo ID requirements to early voting cutbacks to registration restrictions. Among these 16 states with new voting restrictions is my home state of Ohio. In Ohio in 2014, lawmakers cut 6 days of early voting and eliminated the Golden Week, during which voters could register and cast a ballot all in one trip, Mr. Speaker. Of course, Ohio is not alone in its efforts to make it harder for Americans to vote. Mr. Speaker, the freedom to vote is one of Americans' most constitutionally guaranteed rights, and it should be easily accessible to those who want to exercise it. That is why I am honored this Congress to serve as the Deputy Vice Chair of the newly created Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, a caucus dedicated to protecting our democracy by ensuring the fundamental right to vote is safeguarded for all Americans. However, after a long-standing tradition of bipartisanship on voting protections, House Republicans now refuse to bring either bill to the floor for a vote. This is unthinkable, Mr. Speaker. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been reauthorized with bipartisan support 5 times. Congress has a duty to ensure elections are free and transparent so all eligible voters feel comfortable and welcome. I echo President Obama's February the 13th, 2013 statement on the Voting Rights Act. And let me quote, we must all do our part to make sure our God-given rights are protected. That includes one of the most fundamental rights of a democracy, the right to vote, Mr. Speaker. When any American, no matter where they live or what their party, are denied that right, we are betraying our ideals, end of quote. There are 168 days until the presidential election, and our democracy still has far too many missing voices, particularly among those who are already at a disadvantage due to deeply rooted racial and class barriers in our society. We must ensure that voter suppression is not the new normal. In order to have a truly vibrant democracy, the United States must take steps to ensure inclusive voting by reducing barriers to voting. Efforts to suppress voting turnout undermine democracy, and those efforts, Mr. Speaker, are on the wrong side of history. And as I close, Mr. Speaker, the time is now. I am calling on all people, including our community and national leaders, to join me in working to eliminate voter suppression and to restore what so many people fought for, marched for, died for. Mr. Speaker, that's the Voting Rights Act. Human rights organizations like the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, have been at the forefront of these issues, along with my colleagues, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, encouraging and training poll workers and poll protectors. It is up to all of us, Mr. Speaker, to protect the most at risk among us and to expand opportunity for all. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady for making several extremely important observations about the urgency of restoring the Voting Rights Act, of Congress voting up or down. All we're asking for is for members of this House to act on bipartisan legislation that has been introduced in this Congress that would respond to the Supreme Court's decision, adopt a new coverage formula, and allow us to move forward in advance of this consequential presidential election with a system that we can all be confident in will fairly allow everyone who wants to vote the opportunity to vote. It is now my honor and my privilege to yield to the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, someone who had a distinguished record prior to his service in the House as a jurist on the bench, as a civil rights lawyer in North Carolina, and has continued his fight here on the floor of the House of Representatives for the last 10 years on behalf of fairness, justice, and equality, particularly in his capacity as chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. Let me now yield to Congressman G.K. Butterfield.
Let me thank you, Mr. Jeffries, for yielding time this evening, and thank you for your incredible work, not just in the Congressional Black Caucus, but on behalf of the people that you represent in that great borough of Brooklyn, New York. Thank you so very much. And to the gentlelady from Ohio, thank you so very much for all the work that you do. Joyce Beatty, you are an incredible leader in this Congress, and we appreciate you so very much. And I want to thank the two of you for selecting the topic for discussion tonight. It is certainly an appropriate topic. There are so many of us who've been working on enforcement and extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and they're too numerous to mention, but I will certainly single out Congressman John Lewis and Congresswoman Terry Sewell and Congressman Mark Vesey, Congressman John Conyers, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and so many others who have just worked tirelessly to enforce the right to vote, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. Mr. Speaker, on August 6, 1965, and I remember it so very well, it was a few days after I had graduated from high school, this Congress, this House of Representatives where we are seated tonight, and the Senate, which is just a few steps down the hall, together passed the Voting Rights Act. This act was signed by the President of the United States immediately, and then it has had a profound impact on empowering African American communities all across the country to participate in the electoral process. Prior to the Voting Rights Act, it was a sad state of affairs, Mr. Jeffries, in North Carolina and South Carolina and Alabama. It was a very sad state of affairs. In order to register to vote, one had to be able to read and to write. But not just that, they had to be able to satisfy a registrar. In all cases, it was a white registrar. African-American citizens had to satisfy a registrar who in many cases discriminated, that he or she was competent and able to read and to write. And in most instances, those would-be voters were denied the right to vote. In addition to that, laws were passed all across the South that disenfranchised minority groups. Redistricting schemes were drawn to disenfranchise, at-large elections and staggered terms and all of the rest. And so there was a necessity Congressman, for the Voting Rights Act. It was just not a good idea. It was actually a necessity in order to enforce the right to vote. Congress enacted this tool, and it has been very effective. One of the most effective parts of the Voting Rights Act, there are many parts of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 is that part that gives minority communities the right to bring lawsuits, and that applies to every county in the United States. It is a permanent law. It's on the books permanently. It also eliminated the literacy test, but there's another provision that kind of goes unnoticed from time to time, and it's called Section 5. Section 5 is an oversight provision. It gives the federal government the right to pre-clear election changes before they go into effect to determine whether or not these changes would have a discriminatory result in their community. Section 5, Mr. Speaker, does not apply to every county in America. Section 5 only applies to certain states that had a long history of voter discrimination. And in my state, for example, North Carolina, the whole state was not included under Section 5. Only 40 counties were included for preclearance. And so it has been a good law, and it has worked quite well. And as the previous speaker said, it has been extended from time to time. But, Mr. Speaker, on June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 5, first of all, the Supreme Court ruled that Section 5 is a proper exercise of legislative authority, but the Supreme Court surprised us. It determined that the formula used to determine which counties or which states should be subject to Section 5 is outdated. The court suggested that it needed fixing. And so the court called on us here in this Congress to fix it. And the Congressional Black Caucus has been fighting every day since that court decision to try to put together a bipartisan agreement to fix the formula. No one in this Congress has worked harder than Congresswoman Terry Sewell. Her bill is now pending before this House. And we need to fix the formula. We need to do it now. When you look at the 2013 discriminatory election law changes and the 2011 legislative and congressional redistricting, you must conclude, anyone must conclude, that there is a concerted effort in many parts of the country to disenfranchise particular groups of voters from participating in the process. The absence of Section 5 protection allows states, my state included, to pass discriminatory laws that disenfranchise African American voters and other groups. We have seen these laws enacted in state after state all across the country. On July 25th, Mr. Jeffries, 2013, the North Carolina General Assembly passed. Now remember, the Supreme Court decision was June 25th, 2013. 30 days later, I don't know why they didn't do it 30 days earlier. Well, I do know why, and that's because there was a Section 5. But after Section 5 was suspended by the Supreme Court, 30 days later, the General Assembly passed a sweeping voting law that discriminates not only against African Americans, but other minority groups. It discriminates against students and seniors. This law has also cut back on early voting. That's a big deal in our communities. Cut back on early voting by a week and barred same-day voter registration. The law went into effect upon passage, and there is no oversight and no Section 5 to protect us. This is disappointing. This law is regressive and absolutely disgusting. We have to let our state lawmakers know that our voices matter and that all citizens in this country should be able to participate in democracy through unfettered access to the ballot box. And so in closing, the Congressional Black Caucus, of which I am honored to chair, vows to continue our fight to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, to stop the assault on access to the ballot box, because every citizen deserves the right to vote. I thank you for time. I yield back.
I thank the distinguished chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus for his eloquent words and for explaining the practical realities of the Supreme Court's decision to strike down the coverage formula and effectively invalidate Section 5 and the implications that that has had on people all across the country in North Carolina and beyond. I also note that the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 and the coverage formula in Section 4, upon passage in 1965, didn't just impact states in the South, but there are 5 counties in New York City that constitute the Big Apple, and 3 of those counties in the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn were covered by Section 5. Because we recognize that there have been challenges all across this country with respect to the right to vote, and many of us, even beyond the South, have now lost that critical protection, and that's why it's time for Congress to act. I thank the chairman for his continued leadership. It is now my honor to yield to the distinguished gentlelady from the great state of Alabama. She has been a tremendous proponent of the right to vote. We were all in awe of her leadership last year when we were down in Selma, Alabama to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, and thankful for all that she continues to do to uphold that great American tradition that sprung forth from that small city down in Alabama where the distinguished gentlelady hails from. She currently is a sponsor, the lead sponsor of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would fix the problem that the Supreme Court created, and it's now my honor to yield to Representative Terry Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend my distinguished colleague from New York and my distinguished colleague, the gentlelady from Ohio, for this wonderful hour of power on voting. It is my great honor to stand with them, to rise today and to join with my CBC colleagues to discuss the reckless Republican assault on the right to vote in America. We began tonight by bringing attention to the ever-evolving crisis brewing in our democracy. Since the Supreme Court in the Shelby decision gutted the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there has been nothing short of an assault on the right to vote, this most sacred right to vote. This 2016 election will be the first time in my lifetime, and I dare say in the lifetime of the gentleman from New York, that we'll have a presidential election in which there will not be the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as the gentleman so rightfully acknowledged, I welcomed in 2015 100 members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, to my hometown of Selma, Alabama, in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the historic Bloody Sunday March from Selma to Montgomery, where people shed blood, tears. Our own colleague, John Lewis, bludgeoned on that bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 50-some years ago, in order to have the right to vote for all Americans. And on that day, Republicans and Democrats held hands as we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge one more time, as John Lewis likes to say, this time on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. We all had a kumbaya moment, if you will. But we came back to Congress and did nothing to try to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I asked my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, have we really gone so far in the last 10 years? After all, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was amended and reauthorized 5 times, most recently in 2006 under a Republican president, President George Bush, who was with us on that glorious day on the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March to make sure that his support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was there. And so I say to you, in 10 years since 2006, when we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act of 1965, overwhelmingly in both houses of Congress, overwhelmingly we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. And had it not been for the Shelby decision, which gutted Section 5, which provided that pre-clearance formula and made the full protections of the Voting Rights Act null and void, we would still be living under a regime where, as the gentleman so rightly said, it was not only the Deep South states that were part of the coverage formula, but New York was a part of the coverage formula as well. So, you know, the Supreme Court in the Shelby decision really issued a challenge to Congress to come up with a modern-day formula. The challenge was that we shouldn't hold Alabama, states like Alabama and the Deep South, for past discriminations that were so far ago, back in the 1950s and the 60s and the 40s, but rather we should come up with a modern-day formula. Well, you know, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015 does just that. I was privileged to introduce that bill along with my colleagues Linda Sanchez and Judy Chu. And Senator Leahy on the Senate side introduced that bill, and it has a look back not since 1950s or 1960s, but it has a look back of 25 years, since 1990 going forward. And it says that if there have been 5 violations, statewide violations, that a state would be then opted in to preclearance if they had 5. And do you know, Mr. Speaker, that not 1, but 13 states have had violations of voting discrimination over the last 25 years. And those states include California, New York, Arizona, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida. 13 states would actually fall under this rubric. And you know, I think that it's really telling that we in 2016 saw such long lines wrapped around Maricopa County, Arizona, most recently in March during their primary, the presidential election primary in March. And you know why? Because Maricopa County used to be covered under the coverage formula for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and since it no longer has any teeth and has been gutted, they could summarily close down polling stations. It shouldn't surprise you, Mr. Speaker, that in 2008, Maricopa County had 800 polling stations, that it was in 2012, it went down to 400 polling stations, and for 2016, 60 polling stations. And those 60 polling stations covered the whole county of Maricopa County, Phoenix, Arizona, and it was clearly not enough to get all of the folks who wanted to vote to be able to vote. They could close down those polling stations without any advance notification because there was no more Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, my own state of Alabama was one of those states that after the Shelby decision decided to institute photo ID law. And so many of my constituents came up to me and said, well, you know, we need a photo ID to get on the plane these days. We need a photo ID to get a passport. Why shouldn't we need a photo ID, and how is that in some way discriminatory? And I had to remind many of my constituents that so many of our elderly, especially in the rural communities that I represent, many of whom were born by midwives, don't have birth certificates, can't actually readily prove a birth certificate in order to get a photo ID law. Or some seniors and those who are disabled, like my father, who no longer drives, therefore doesn't have a driver's license. He was a 9-time stroke victim, actually a survivor, a stroke survivor. He's still with us today. But my dad was determined to get that photo ID in 2014 when Alabama's law came into effect. He was highly motivated, Mr. Speaker, because his daughter's name was on a ballot and he wanted to be able to vote. And I want you to know that it took my dad 5 hours to get a photo ID. Now, if that's not a barrier, you say to yourself, 5 hours? Why would it take 5 hours? Well, Dallas County Courthouse has been, is a courthouse that actually was grandfathered into the ADA laws, and so did not have to have a ramp by which people who have wheelchairs can get readily into the courthouse. It had been grandfathered in. You know, we were very blessed to have a gentleman help us get my dad up those 7 stairs into the courthouse. But when we got to the courthouse, because the voter registration was on the 2nd floor, we had to take an elevator upstairs. Lo and behold, that particular day, the one elevator bank was what? Actually out of service. Out of service. Now, my mom, having been a former member of the city council in Selma and obviously a very well-known member of the citizens of Selma, she could go across the hall and talk to the probate judge's office and say, look, we're here today to get this photo ID, this non-driving photo voter ID, so that my husband can vote. It took an hour and a half, but they got someone to service that elevator. And by the time that elevator was working and we got up to the 2nd floor, lo and behold, it was 11:30, and guess what? Lunchtime. Now, I say to you, Mr. Speaker, we no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar. We no longer have to recite all 67 counties in the state of Alabama in order to get a voter registration card. But we should not, in America, have to go through so many hoops in order to exercise the most fundamental right, the most sacred right of our democracy, the right to vote. And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that any denial of access to the ballot box, to me, it totally obstruates and really undermines the integrity of the electoral process. If one person who wants to go out and vote has to stand in line for hours upon hours and can't actually physically stand in line because they have other obligations like children and daycare and jobs, then it's unfair. We are actually limiting access to the ballot box, which actually goes to the integrity of our electoral process. It is the fundamental to our democracy. So I say to you tonight, I am honored to join my CBC colleagues as we fight for the opportunity of all Americans to have equal access to the ballot box. You know, Mr. Speaker, my state of Alabama had the gall, after having a photo ID requirement, to actually, during the state budgetary process, decide to close down 30 DMV, driver's motor vehicle license offices, which is, all of us know, the most popular form of photo ID is a driver's license. So to actually require a citizen to have a photo ID and then to close down DMV offices in rural parts of my district in the state of Alabama was really unconscionable.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I sure will.
And isn't in fact the case that a disproportionately high number of those DMV offices that the state of Alabama just happened to decide to close were in predominantly African-American parts of the state of Alabama?
They were. Those DMV offices, as the gentleman from New York so aptly recited, were mostly located in heavily African-American parts of the state of Alabama, but they were also predominantly rural parts of the district of the state of Alabama. And those same areas have hard time having transportation, public transportation, to get around in those areas. So they said, of course, that the reason why they were closing down these DMV offices had nothing to do with voting, of course, but had to do with the fact that there was serious budgetary constraints. Well, whether it was overt, obviously one of the consequences of that, of those closures of those DMV offices, was to limit access to those people getting photo IDs, and therefore the most popular form of photo ID, which is a driver's license, and therefore limiting their ability to go vote. Now, you know, I did speak with our governor, and he did open up those DMV offices on a limited basis, but only on a limited basis. And I say to you that it's unacceptable in America to have any limitations on the right to vote. And I really ask all of my colleagues, especially those that have come to Selma over the years with John Lewis on these pilgrimages, to really search deep in their hearts if they're really about access to the ballot box and being able to make sure that all Americans have an opportunity to exercise this fundamental right. Then why would we not make it easier for people to vote? You know, instead of going the way of Alabama and having these photo ID laws, seems to me all of us should be adopting laws like the state of Oregon, which has mailing in ballots, same-day registration. There are ways that we can make it much easier for every American to exercise that most fundamental right to vote. And so tonight I ask my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to join in with the 168 co-sponsors of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and join us in this fight to make sure that we do a modern-day formula with a look back of since 1990 going forward, to look at whether or not there have been discriminatory acts that have limited people's access to the ballot box. I also ask my colleagues to join us every Tuesday that we are in session. We've declared it to be Restoration Tuesday, and on those Tuesdays, since Tuesdays are the days that we vote, we go to the well of the floor, we talk about why it's important to restore the vote. So I want to thank my colleagues, the gentleman from New York and the gentlewoman from Ohio, for leading us in this charge tonight. I hope that it will spill over to tomorrow, which is Restoration Tuesday, where we can really talk about the modern day examples of people being denied access to the ballot box because of people's inability to actually get the credentials that people require them to have, or because they have to work late. They don't have the ability to be able to drop everything and go and vote and stand in long lines if those polling stations have been closed. So I just say all this to say that it's really imperative, I think, that we put real action behind our talk. We do a lot of talking about our democracy and upholding our Constitution, and this is an opportunity for this august body to actually do something about it. And I want to say in closing, I want to quote one of our Republican colleagues who has been in this fight for a very long time. That's the Wisconsin Republican Congressman Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin, who I think really best summed it up when he wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times after witnessing those long lines in Maricopa County, Arizona. He wrote the following. Wisconsin Republican Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, he said, "Ensuring that every eligible voter can cast a ballot without fear, deterrence, and prejudice is a basic American right. I would rather lose my job than suppress votes to keep it." I have to repeat that. I would rather lose my job than suppress votes to keep it. My Republican colleague went on to say that our credibility as elected officials depends on the fairness of our elections. Voting rights, Mr. Speaker, transcends partisan agendas. It really solidifies that equality in voting is the democratic way. I ask my colleagues to join all of us in this fight for our democracy. This crisis that we're in is a crisis that we can fix in Congress by coming up with a modern-day formula. We already have several bills in the House. Congressman Sensenbrenner and Conyers introduced a Voting Rights Amendment Act. I've introduced a Voting Rights Advancement Act. There are several bills, 2 bills, in fact, that would actually come up with a modern-day formula. I dare this august body to actually act on one. I'm here to tell you that the American people will be stronger and this republic will be stronger because of it. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady from Alabama, my good friend Terry Sewell, for a very compelling and comprehensive and complete analysis of the situation that we find ourselves in and the practical consequences of the Supreme Court's decision, and the fact that there are people all across this country, in Alabama and in other parts of this great republic, who are determined to elevate themselves by suppressing the ability of others to participate in the democratic process. And that's a shame. It's a stain on our democracy, and it's time for this Congress to act. Let me now yield to my classmate, my good friend, the distinguished gentleman from the Lone Star State, who himself has been championing the issue of fair redistricting, who's personally been impacted in terms of his capacity as a representative to make sure that lines are fairly drawn, and most recently has announced the formulation of the Voting Rights Caucus here in the Congress. He's been a tremendous leader in this area, great member of the House of Representatives. Let me now yield to Representative Mark Vesey.
Thank you very much, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries from New York and Congresswoman Joyce Beatty from Ohio, for everything that you're doing on raising this issue tonight. It is very timely, considering everything that we're going through right now. And when you think about the Voting Rights Act, it is literally the single most important piece of legislation that has ever been passed in the history of the United States as it deals with individuals' right to vote. But as you know, 3 years ago, the Supreme Court regressed and sent us back and by gutting Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And not only was that bad because it hurt the Voting Rights Act, but it was also bad because of everything that it did to propel states around the country from also retrogressing and sending us back in the area of voting rights. You're starting to hear so many stories of states and localities that are passing more and more laws to restrict the right to vote, making it harder for young people to vote, seniors, the disabled, people that move around a lot and are transient, people that don't necessarily have the money that they need in order to obtain the proper identification. And you heard Congresswoman Sewell when she so eloquently talked about the fact that oftentimes, particularly in the South, people were born by midwives. And so they don't necessarily have. We have a lot of baby boomers that are out there. People think these things happened a long time ago. That's the thing that you hear all the time. But there are people that are living here today, a lot of baby boomers that were born down in the piney woods of East Texas, that were born in other parts of the South that don't have the proper documentation that they need in order to be able to vote. I've met people since I've been involved in campaigns and elections and as an elected official that didn't have the proper ID to vote. And I got to tell you, there are many of them out there. And just hours after the Supreme Court made the decision in 2013 that my home state of Texas implemented the most egregious voter ID law in the entire country, just hours after the Supreme Court gutted Section 4, they moved to re-implement the law. And that was very disappointing, considering that a appeals court had already said that the voter ID law in Texas was one of the worst in the country.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Absolutely.
Is it in fact the case that, as it relates to that particular voter ID law in Texas, that individuals are able to vote if they've got a gun license, identification card, but are not able to vote under that draconian Texas law with a college ID?
That is correct. If you have a ID that is issued to you by the University of Texas or Texas A&M or Prairie View A&M University, that same ID, that same student ID that can be used to identify yourself to campus police officers, that can be used to identify yourself for other things that you would need an ID for, it will not work in order for you to go and vote. But if you have a concealed handgun license, then you can vote. And the concealed handgun license are mostly used by white males in the state. And it's really unfair that a more diverse form of ID like the student ID is not allowed under Texas laws. And so that was one of the reasons why I became the lead plaintiff on the voter ID lawsuit, Congressman Jeffries. It's Vesey versus Abbott. And we're going to continue to fight. We just got news today that the full circuit court, the Fifth Circuit Court, is going to take up our case. And I'm going to continue to work here in Congress, continue to work in Texas, continue to work in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to protect the voting rights of individuals that have been wronged. Also want to point out that, you know, it's, again, you oftentimes hear people say that we have progressed as a country and we don't need these laws. But when you look at what is going on in Texas, when you look at what is going on across the South, I just think we can't sit back anymore. We can't sit back and be idle and say, oh no, well, you know, we're doing a little bit better. And so these people that are going to be discriminated against, the transient, the college students, the people that don't necessarily have their birth documentation in order like other people may have. We just can't sit back and say, you know, we're going to just move on and forget about them. We have to fight for those individuals as well, because it's their right to vote, and we must protect it. And in 2016, I just think that we should be making it easier for citizens to vote. You know, we should be talking about things like same-day, you know, registration. We should be working together, you know, Democrats and Republicans, on ways to ease lines when it comes to voting in places. We should be looking at ways that we can make it to where we have more days to vote early. You're starting to hear about laws around the country to scale back the number of in-person early voting days. And I just think that that's wrong. Again, I want to thank you for your leadership. Thank you for pointing out that I have introduced the first Congressional Voting Rights Caucus to help aid and fight in the battle, along with so many of the other task force and organizations that are here in Congress that are working on those issues. And we want to continue to make sure together, again, and we need to do it in a bipartisan manner, that we all protect the right to vote. And again, I want to thank you and the Congresswoman from Ohio, Representative Beatty, on your work and passion on this issue.
I thank my good friend for his leadership on this very important issue, for the steps that you have taken both here in Congress with the initiation of the Voting Rights Caucus, as well as down in Texas as the lead plaintiff on the VC versus Abbott lawsuit to challenge the voter ID requirements, the draconian requirements that have been imposed by the state of Texas. It should shock the conscience of every American that a state would impose a restriction that allows licensed gun owners to vote who disproportionately happen to be of a certain demographic, white male, but would deny the legitimacy of IDs that the state of Texas itself issues. Texas A&M, the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Houston, other institutions, these are all public universities. And these individuals, these students, pay tuition to go to these public universities. And in response, they issued identification vehicles, identification cards. But the state of Texas has seen fit to say that's not valid in order to vote. And I think that one example, and we've heard several others, basically exposes the fact that the movement to impose voter identification requirements is a fraud itself. It's a sham. The whole argument behind it is that we're trying to protect the integrity of the voting system. But here's the problem. You're protecting the integrity of the voting system by imposing a solution in search of a problem. Because none of these individuals in any of these states has been able to produce a scintilla of evidence of fraud. In fact, there are studies that have shown that there have been over 1 billion instances of Americans exercising the right to vote without any evidence of misrepresentation, over 1 billion times. And the number of instances of questionable voting, less than 50. And yet, in state after state, we see voter identification laws being imposed on the people. It's not designed to protect the integrity of anything. It's designed to protect certain individuals and maintain their power in the face of troubling demographic changes that are occurring in America. Let's call it like it is. In the few moments remaining, let me now yield. Let me ask the chairman, how much time do we have remaining in this special order?
The gentleman has 4 minutes remaining.
Okay, let me now yield a few moments to someone who has been a tremendous champion from the great state of Texas and representing her people in Houston, and a phenomenal member of the Judiciary Committee, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the distinguished gentleman from New York, which shows that the issues of voter empowerment are nationwide, and the gentlelady from Ohio, who has been steadfast on important issues that deal with the empowerment of all Americans. I note that my colleague from Texas made his presentation, Congressman Beatty, who everyone knows was the plaintiff in Texas for the voter ID law. And I wanted to come this evening very briefly to, submit a full statement into the record, but to make this point, because let me read the headline or the topic again: Democracy in Crisis, the Reckless Republican Assault on the Right to Vote in America. It did not have to be, for it is evident that we have dealt with voter empowerment in a bipartisan way. The very difficult journey that Lyndon Baines Johnson took in 1965 after the foot soldiers and Dr. Martin Luther King and others made their momentous march and statement, including a letter from a Birmingham jail that captured the history or the sentiment and the movement of the civil rights movement in the very basic words, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. With that power behind him, he was able to frame the Voting Rights Act in a bipartisan manner with Republicans from the North and what we used to call Dixiecrats from the South. It can be done. And then in 2006, 2007, I was privileged to have another Texan, George W. Bush, as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, after 15,000 pages of testimony with a Republican chairman, that we went and passed a voter reauthorization 1965 Voting Rights Act. Let me close with these points about the pointedness, Mr. Jeffries, of what voting power actually means. What it means is that we would not have the North Carolina set of voting laws, if you will, that cut Sunday voting or early voting, had one of the most horrific voter ID laws. We would not have the Texas voter ID law that disenfranchised thousands upon thousands of Hispanics because of no DPS offices, Department of Public Safety offices, in their location. Finally, we would not have an attempt to cut billions of dollars from food stamps, an attempt to cut trillions of dollars from education for our children, the status that we're in right now, trying to seek full funding of the President's emergency funding of $1.9 billion for the Zika virus. This is what voting power means. And finally, after the Supreme Court instructed the Congress or told the Congress that we needed to have a new bill, we would not have the predicament that we're in now. I yield back to the gentleman. We need voting power, and that's what voting rights are all about.
Thank the distinguished gentlelady. The right to vote is fundamental to the integrity of our democracy, and as Lyndon Baines Johnson said from this very chamber shortly before the Voting Rights Act was passed into law a few months later, we shall overcome.